The bustling hum of the restaurant was a familiar soundtrack for the evening shift. The clink of plates, the sizzle of steaks on the grill, and the soft murmur of conversations filled the air. But tonight was different. Tonight, as the door swung open, a new wave of customers flooded in. Among them, a quiet figure, dressed in a worn leather jacket and a worn-out cap, stepped inside. He moved with the kind of confidence that could only come from years of experience in the world, but his identity remained concealed behind his unassuming appearance. Emma, the waitress, had just finished taking an order from a group of rowdy college students. As she walked by, her eyes flickered to the man sitting alone at a corner table. The flicker of recognition was brief. Her mind was already calculating tips and multitasking through the usual rush. But then the man ordered a whiskey, and she overheard a casual remark to the bartender. "I'll have whatever Clint would have picked." Emma's face tightened in an instant. She had heard the rumors. Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, the director, the man who had been more than just an icon in Hollywood. Whispers floated around the staff from time to time about the mysterious owner of the restaurant, but Emma didn't care. She'd been working here for months, and nothing about the place or its enigmatic owner intrigued her. But as she delivered his drink, Emma, exhausted and slightly irritated, couldn't hold back. She leaned in, half smiling, and with a sharp edge to her voice said, "You know, it must be nice to pretend you're someone important around here. If you were really Clint Eastwood, you wouldn't be sitting alone at a table in the corner." The man's eyes flickered up to meet hers, calm, steady. He didn't smile, didn't react the way she expected. His voice, when it came, was cool, low, and almost nostalgic. "You'd be surprised," he said softly. Emma, momentarily caught off guard, just shrugged it off, turning to the next table without a second thought. After all, Clint Eastwood wasn't here. Not really, at least that's what she thought. Before we jump into today's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you love powerful stories of justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so you never miss what's coming next. Now, let's get started. The night wore on, and the restaurant grew busier by the minute. The kitchen buzzed with the rhythm of orders, and the waitstaff scrambled between tables, each movement more rushed than the last. Emma had already forgotten about the mysterious man in the corner, until the moment arrived that would change everything. It started with a sudden hush that spread through the room, like a ripple through water. She was halfway to a table when she caught sight of the man again, but this time, there was something different. He had taken out his phone, flipping it open with an air of calm authority, his fingers typing quickly. Emma tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just another celebrity playing with their phone. But then, the conversation from a few minutes ago came rushing back to her. Clint would have picked. Her thoughts were interrupted by her manager, Rick, storming toward her, his face pale, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a look of utter shock. "Emma," he called, his voice tight, "I need you to go over to Mr. Eastwood's table. He's asking for you." The words hit her like a slap. She blinked, trying to process. She had insulted Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood. Her stomach twisted into knots. She'd been rude, dismissive, even mocking. And now he wanted to speak to her? The realization hit her in waves. She hadn't just offended a regular customer. She had insulted one of the most respected figures in Hollywood. Rick didn't give her much time to gather herself. "Go now. Don't keep him waiting," he ordered, his tone firm but laced with an undercurrent of fear. Emma felt her heart hammer in her chest as she approached the corner booth where the man sat, now standing, his phone closed and resting beside his drink. She wiped her hands nervously on her apron, attempting to steady her breathing. As she drew closer, Clint Eastwood, because now there was no doubt who he was, looked up at her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something sharp in his gaze, something that made Emma's breath hitch. "I heard you had some things to say earlier," he said, his voice even and direct. The weight of the situation bore down on her as Emma froze. her mind racing for the right words, the right apology. But all she could manage was a stammer. I didn't know." "I'm sure you didn't," Clint interrupted, his tone still calm, but there was a glint of something in his eyes now. Something hard, unyielding. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "But I'm not someone you should take lightly, Emma." Her face flushed a deep red, her heart sinking into the pit of her stomach. He knew her name. He knew her name. She couldn't back out now. The tension between them hung in the air, thick and palpable. Every eye in the restaurant was on them. The staff was whispering in the back, and the other patrons tried to pretend they weren't eavesdropping, but the whole room felt like it was holding its breath. Clint didn't wait for her to respond. He stood up, his towering presence filling the space. "I'm going to give you an opportunity to make this right," he said, his words deliberate. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but Clint cut her off again. "Not now," he said, walking toward the door. "I'll be waiting for you tomorrow, same time. I want you to prove that you have the courage to face your mistakes. If you don't show up—" He paused, letting the silence stretch out. "Then we'll see how this plays out." The door swung open behind him, and Clint Eastwood disappeared into the night, leaving Emma standing frozen, her hands shaking, and her mind reeling with the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had no idea what he meant by "see how this plays out," but she knew one thing: she couldn't back down now. Emma had underestimated him. She had insulted him, dismissed him like he was just another person she could ignore. But Clint Eastwood wasn't just anyone. He was a force to be reckoned with. And now she had to face the consequences. The night after Clint Eastwood's visit, Emma couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over in her mind. The way Clint had looked at her, the calm authority in his voice, the weight of his words that seemed to carry the power of years of experience. She knew she had made a mistake, but how could she possibly fix it? What could she even do to prove herself worthy of his forgiveness? Or worse, his respect? By morning, her stomach was in knots. The idea of facing Clint again sent a wave of anxiety through her body. She had worked in this restaurant for months, and nothing had ever prepared her for the reality of encountering a Hollywood legend like him. The restaurant buzzed with rumors about his visit, and the staff couldn't stop talking about what had happened. Rick, the manager, had been more than just concerned. He was almost terrified. Every time Emma walked past him, his gaze flicked nervously toward her. He had been there when Clint made the ultimatum, and it was clear he wasn't sure what to expect next. "Emma," Rick called, his voice tight as she walked into the kitchen. He glanced over his shoulder before lowering his voice. "You've got to make things right. He's not a man you want to cross. You know that, right?" "I know," she muttered, barely hearing him as her mind churned with doubt. That evening, Emma prepared herself in a way she had never done before. She dressed with care, nothing too flashy, nothing too casual. She wanted to look professional, calm, and composed. But deep down, she wasn't sure what kind of person she was supposed to be to face Clint. The shift felt like the longest one of her life. When the clock finally struck the hour Clint had mentioned, Emma found herself standing at the entrance of the restaurant, looking out the window, waiting. She couldn't help but replay the scenario in her mind over and over again. Would he still be angry? Would he embarrass her in front of everyone? Or worse, would he make an example of her? As if summoned by her thoughts, Clint walked in. His presence filled the room instantly. He had an air of confidence about him that demanded attention, but there was something different now, something that made Emma's heart race in her chest. His gaze flicked toward her as he stepped inside, and his expression was unreadable. He wasn't here to apologize. He wasn't here to play nice. This was something else entirely. "Right on time," he said with a small, knowing smile, his voice low but steady. "I see you're keeping your word." Emma swallowed, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her. "I'm here," she managed to say, her voice shaky. "I wanted to apologize." for what I said. I was rude, and I didn't mean it." Clint didn't respond immediately. He studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing her sincerity. His silence was a weight in the air, pressing down on her until she thought she might collapse. The whole room seemed to fade into the background as he took a step closer, his gaze piercing through her. "You don't get it, do you?" Clint said, his voice cutting through the tension. Emma's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "You don't get how many people in this world don't know their place. How many people think they can talk down to others just because they have a little power or fame? Or maybe it's because they've been too comfortable, too used to being in control." The words hit her harder than she expected. Emma clenched her fists, the sting of realization starting to gnaw at her. He wasn't just talking about the restaurant or about her. He was talking about something bigger, about pride, humility, and respect. "I don't want an apology just for the sake of it," Clint continued, his voice unwavering. "I want to see if you can handle this. I want to see if you can face what you've done and prove that you're not just another person who expects things to be handed to them." The challenge in his words burned like fire in her chest. She wanted to back down, wanted to apologize again and get it over with, but something in her refused to let her. Was this some twisted test? Or was it a chance to prove she wasn't just another person who took everything for granted? Clint's eyes locked onto hers, his expression fierce. "The real question is, Emma, are you willing to face the consequences of your actions no matter how hard it gets?" Emma's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about an apology anymore. This was about her. About proving she could rise above her mistakes, about taking responsibility in a way that few people ever do. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice firmer than she had expected it to be. Clint's lips curled into a slow smile, but there was no warmth in it. Only the acknowledgement of someone who had been through more than their fair share of tests, challenges, and failures. "Good," he said. "Let's see if you can follow through." The tension in the room built to an unbearable level, and Emma felt her heart pounding in her chest as she realized that this wasn't just a test of humility. It was a test of everything she was capable of. As Clint turned to leave, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. "Tomorrow. We'll see if you're ready." And with that, he was gone. The day had arrived. Emma could barely sleep the night before, her mind consumed by the promise Clint Eastwood had made. The weight of his challenge hung over her, and every second of the day felt like a ticking clock, drawing her closer to the inevitable moment when she would have to face him. By the time she arrived at the restaurant, it was early afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the empty tables. The quiet felt surreal, as if the world was holding its breath. Emma stood in front of the entrance, hesitating for a moment before pushing open the door. The air inside was thick with anticipation, and the few staff members who were there exchanged nervous glances. They knew what was coming, and no one seemed eager to witness it. Rick was there, waiting by the bar. His usual cool demeanor was gone. He looked visibly anxious, constantly glancing toward the door. "He's here," he said quietly, almost as if he was afraid to speak too loudly. "He's been waiting for you." Emma nodded, swallowing hard. Her legs felt like lead as she walked toward the back of the restaurant where Clint had taken his seat by the window, just like the night before. This time, however, there was no casual smile, no easygoing air. He was sitting tall, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the door as though he had been expecting her all along. Clint didn't greet her with the same calm indifference as before. There was a seriousness in his gaze now, an intensity that made the air feel charged, as though something big was about to happen. "You showed up," he said, his voice low but sharp, cutting through the stillness. There was a trace of approval in his tone, but it was tinged with something else, something that felt like a challenge. "But this isn't about showing up. This is about proving you can handle what you've done, proving you can learn from your mistakes and rise above them." Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself. Every nerve in her body was on edge, but this was it. the moment she had been dreading and anticipating. She could feel the eyes of the staff on her from behind, their silent judgment making the room feel even more suffocating. But she couldn't back down now, not after everything that had led to this. "I'm here," she said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything that had been building. "I'm ready to face whatever comes next. But I need you to know, I wasn't just being rude for the sake of it. I was frustrated. I've been frustrated with everything lately. Life's been hard, and I've been pushing people away without even realizing it. I lashed out at you because I didn't know how to deal with my own mistakes. I know that's not an excuse, but it's the truth." Clint studied her silently, his eyes sharp, dissecting every word she said. He didn't speak, but Emma could feel his presence weighing on her, forcing her to confront her own vulnerabilities in ways she hadn't expected. "You think I'm just some angry kid who's got a lot of growing up to do, don't you?" she continued, her voice growing a little stronger, a little more sure. "But you're wrong. I'm not that person anymore. I know what I did, and I know I can do better. But you're the one who's got to let me prove it." Clint's gaze softened ever so slightly, but there was no mistaking the way he still held her in check. "You think it's that simple?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "You think you can just waltz in here, say a few words, and suddenly everything's fixed?" The tension in the room rose, and Emma felt the pressure mounting, each second feeling heavier than the last. But this was the turning point. This was where it either all came crashing down, or she found the strength to rise above it. "I'm not asking for everything to be fixed," Emma said, her voice growing more determined. "I'm asking for the chance to show you that I can do better. I've made mistakes, but I've learned from them, and that's more than a lot of people can say." Clint stood up from his seat slowly, his movements deliberate. He walked toward her, his steps measured, his eyes never leaving hers. For a moment it felt as though the whole world had shrunk to just the two of them, locked in this battle of wills. "You're right," Clint said, his voice now low, almost contemplative. "People don't often learn. They make the same mistakes over and over again and they never face the consequences. But you've got a chance here, and it's not about what you say. It's about what you do." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing her very soul. "I've seen a lot of people try to get by without ever truly facing who they are. They hide behind their pride, their mistakes, their failures, but you're standing here, facing it all, and that's worth something." Emma felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly followed by uncertainty. She had done everything she could, and yet Clint's words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of something more. Would he truly give her the chance to prove herself? Or was this just another test, another impossible bar to clear? Clint nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "I'm going to give you that chance," he said, his tone now measured, deliberate. "But it's up to you to take it. You have the potential to do something great, Emma. Don't waste it." With that, Clint turned and walked out of the restaurant without another word. Emma stood there, breathless, staring after him, her mind racing to comprehend the weight of what had just happened. She had done it. She had faced the impossible, confronted her own flaws, and shown Clint Eastwood, of all people, that she had the strength to stand up and make things right. The tension in the room began to lift, but Emma knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning, and she would never be the same again. The following days passed in a blur for Emma. She kept replaying the confrontation with Clint Eastwood over and over in her mind, trying to process everything. Her heart raced every time she thought of his words. "You have the potential to do something great, Emma. Don't waste it." His challenge had cut through her self-doubt like a knife, leaving her shaken, yet strangely emboldened. At the restaurant, the atmosphere had shifted. The staff watched her with a mixture of curiosity and respect, like she had somehow earned their unspoken approval. Rick, too, seemed to be viewing her in a new light. His usual nervousness had faded, replaced by a quiet, tentative trust. Still, it wasn't easy. Every day, Emma found herself doubting her own strength, her ability to truly change. Her self-sabotaging habits hadn't vanished overnight. There were moments when she felt like a fraud, like she was playing a part in some grand performance, pretending to be someone she wasn't. But there were also moments, small, almost insignificant, where she saw herself differently. She began to engage more with the customers, with the people around her. The snarky remarks that had once slipped from her lips without a second thought were replaced by genuine conversations. She no longer rushed through her shift, resentful of the endless demands of the job. Instead, she found herself investing in the people she served, trying to make each moment count. Then came the evening Clint returned. Emma wasn't prepared for it. Her nerves shot through the roof as soon as she saw him walking through the door again, his presence as commanding as ever. It felt like an unspoken test. Would she live up to the challenge he had set? Clint's eyes found hers across the room, and for the briefest moment he seemed to study her, his gaze sharp, but not as piercing as it had been before. It was different this time, like he was watching, waiting for her to reveal the growth she had claimed to have. She walked toward him with steady steps, her heart pounding, but her head clearer than it had ever been. The old Emma would have felt defensive, anxious, even afraid. But not now. Not this time. "Good to see you again, Clint," she said, the words coming out naturally with no trace of hesitation. It was a small thing, but it felt like a victory. Clint nodded, his expression unreadable. "How have you been?" he asked, his voice low. "I've been working on myself," Emma said, meeting his gaze with a newfound steadiness. "I'm not the person I was before. I've been learning about myself, about how to be better at this job, and how to treat people with more respect." Clint didn't respond right away. Instead, he simply sat back in his chair, giving her a long look. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he said, "You've got a long way to go, Emma. But that's the thing about life. It's not about being perfect. It's about facing what you did wrong and making the choice to do better." Emma nodded, a sense of clarity settling over her. She knew he was right. There would always be more to learn, more to overcome. But it wasn't about reaching some idealized version of herself. It was about progress, about persistence. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the chance, for making me see things differently." Clint's lips twitched into a small smile. An acknowledgement, nothing more. He didn't need to say anything else. His presence had done more than enough. His words had forced Emma to confront herself in a way she hadn't thought possible, and for that, she was grateful. As Clint stood up to leave, he turned to her once more. "I don't expect you to be perfect," he said, his tone softer now, "but I do expect you to keep going. Don't let the world tell you who you are. You define that." Emma watched him walk out, the weight of his words settling deep within her. The restaurant, the staff, the customers, all of it seemed to fade into the background as she stood there, processing the enormity of the journey she had started. She wasn't the same person she had been when this all started, and she wasn't sure where the road would take her. But for the first time in a long time, she believed she could face whatever came next. She had learned to take responsibility, to face her mistakes head on, and, most importantly, to believe in the possibility of change. As she turned back to her duties, Emma knew that she had only just begun. The path ahead wasn't easy, and it would demand everything from her, but for the first time, she felt ready. And with that readiness came a sense of peace, a sense of purpose. Emma had found a new strength in herself, and Clint Eastwood had shown her that sometimes the hardest lessons in life come not from failure, but from the willingness to rise from it. The weeks that followed Clint Eastwood's visit were a quiet turning point for Emma. The changes she had started to make weren't immediate, and they weren't perfect. She still stumbled, still caught herself in moments of frustration and doubt. But there was a quiet strength now, a sense of resolve that hadn't been there before. The staff at the restaurant had started to look at her differently, not with judgment, but with respect. They had witnessed the transformation firsthand. Rick, who had once been unsure about Emma's future, now offered words of encouragement, his tone less patronizing and more supportive. Even the regular customers, the ones who had been there for years, began to notice the shift in her demeanor. Still, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was something missing. The lessons she'd learned, the changes she'd made, they had all been for herself, but a part of her couldn't help but wonder if Clint Eastwood's visit had been just a chapter in a much larger story. She hadn't seen him since that day, and she wasn't sure if their paths would cross again, but she had made a promise to herself that no matter what, she would keep moving forward, keep growing. One night, after the restaurant had closed, Emma found herself standing by the front window gazing out at the empty street. The city felt quiet, almost distant, as though everything had slowed down just for her to reflect. She thought about the way Clint had walked away that day, his final words lingering in the air. "Don't let the world tell you who you are. You define that." She wasn't sure if she would ever truly understand Clint Eastwood, or if she would ever be able to repay him for the opportunity he had given her. But she knew that he had shown her a glimpse of the person she could become, if she was brave enough to keep fighting for it. The restaurant's neon sign flickered as Emma turned away from the window. She didn't need answers right now. She didn't need a clear resolution. What mattered was that she was no longer afraid of the uncertainty. As she walked back into the heart of the restaurant, her eyes caught the reflection of her own face in the glass. She didn't recognize the girl staring back at her. She was different now, shaped by the choices she'd made, by the mistakes she'd learned from. And though the road ahead was still unclear, Emma felt ready to face it, one step at a time. The sound of a bell chiming as the door opened brought her back to the present. A customer had walked in, and Emma greeted them with a calm, practiced smile. It was nothing extraordinary, just a simple gesture. But in that moment, she realized it was enough. The world didn't need to tell her who she was. She was writing her own story now, page by page, and for the first time, she felt as though she could truly own it. The camera lingers on Emma's face, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips as the screen fades to black. The echoes of Clint's words reverberate in the silence, leaving the audience with a sense of quiet reflection, of growth, change, and the possibility of redemption. The story isn't over. It's just beginning. Thank you for watching. Maya's story reminds us that standing up for what's right can create lasting change. Whether it's overcoming adversity or challenging injustice, your voice matters. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment with your thoughts on the story. Let's keep this conversation going. And remember, sharing these stories helps spread the message of justice and fairness, one act of courage at a time. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.